Also that afternoon, co-conspirator 4 met with the acting attorney general and told him that the defendant had decided to put co-conspirator 4 in charge of the Justice Department. The acting attorney general responded that he would not accept being fired by a subordinate and immediately scheduled a meeting with the defendant for that evening. On the evening of January 3rd, the defendant met for a briefing on overseas national security issue with the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and other senior national secretary advisor. The chairman briefed the defendant on the issue, which had previously arisen in December, as well as possible ways the defendant could handle it. When the chairman and another advisor recommended that the defendant take no action because inauguration day was only 17 days away and any course of action could trigger something unhelpful, the defendant calmly agreed, stating, "Yeah, you're right. It's too late for us. We're going to give that to the next guy." The defendant moved immediately from the national security briefing to the meeting that the acting attorney general had requested earlier that day, which included co-conspirator 4, the acting attorney general, and the acting deputy attorney general, the Justice Department assistant attorney general for the Office of Legal Counsel, the White House counsel, a deputy White House counsel, and a senior advisor. At this meeting, the defendant expressed frustration with the acting attorney general for failing to do anything to overturn the election results, and the group discussed co-conspirator 4 plan to investigate purported election fraud and to send his proposed letter to the state officials, a copy of which was prepared to the defendant during the meeting. The defendant relented in his plan to replace the acting attorney general with co-conspirator 4 only when he was told that it would result in a massive resignation at the Justice Department and of his own White House counsel. At the meeting in the Oval Office on the night of January 3rd, co-conspirator 4 suggested that the Justice Department should opine that the vice president could exceed his lawful authorities during the certification proceedings and change the election outcome. When the assistant attorney general for the Office of Legal Counsel began to explain why the Justice Department should not do so, the defendant said, "No one here should be talking to the vice president. I'm talking to the vice president," and ended the discussion. The defendant attorney attempts to enlist the vice president to fraudulently alter the election resulted at the January 6th certification proceedings. As the January 6th congressional certification proceedings approach and other efforts to impair, obstruct, and defeat the federal government functions failed, the defendant sought to enlist the vice president to use his ceremonial roles as the certification to fraudulently alter the election results. The defendant did this first by using knowingly false claims of election fraud to convince the vice president to accept the defendant's fraudulent electors reject legitimate electoral votes or send legitimate electoral votes to the state legislature for review rather than count them. When that failed, the defendant attempted to use a crowd of supporters that he had gathered in Washington, D.C. to pressure the vice president to fraudulently alter the election results. On December 19, 2020, the altering, after cultivating widespread anger and resentment for weeks with his knowing false claims of election fraud, the defendant urged his supporters to travel to Washington on the day of the certification proceedings, tweeting big protests in December in D.C. on January 6th. Be there, will be wild. Throughout late December, he urged his supporters to come to Washington for January 6th. On December 23rd, the defendant retweeted a memo titled, Operation Pence card, which falsely asserted that the vice president could, among other things, unilaterally disqualify legitimate electors from 6 targeted states. On the same day, co-conspirator 2 circulated a two-page memorandum outlining a plan for the vice president to unlawfully declare the defendant the certified winner of the presidential election. In the memorandum, co-conspirator 2 claimed that 7 states had transmitted 2 slates of electors and proposed that the vice president announce that because of the ongoing disputes in the 7 states, there there are no electors that can be deemed validly appointed in those states. Next, co-conspirator 2 proposed step 2 that he acknowledged violated the ECA, advocating that in the end, Pence give gravel President Trump as a re-elect. Just 2 months earlier, on October 11th, co-conspirator 2 had taken the opposite position, writing that neither the Constitution nor the ECA provided the vice president discretion in the counting of the election votes or permitted him to make the determination on his own. On several private phone calls in late December and early January, the defendant repeatedly knowing false claims of election fraud and directly pressured the vice president to use his ceremonial role at the certification proceedings on January 6 to fraudulently overturn the results of the election, and the vice president resisted, including on December 25th, when the vice president called the defendant to wish him a Merry Christmas. The defendant quickly turned the conversation to January 6th and his request that the vice president reject electoral votes that day. The vice president pushed back, telling the defendant, as the vice president already had in previous conversations, "You know, I don't think I have the authority to change the outcome." On December 29th, as reflected in the vice president contemptuous notes, the defendant falsely told the vice president that the Justice Department was finding major infractions. On January 1st, the defendant called the vice president and berated him because he had learned that the vice president had opposed a lawsuit seeking a judicial decision that at the certification that the vice president had the authority to reject or return votes to the state under the Constitution. The vice president responded that he thought there was no constitutional basis for such authorities and that it was improper. In response, the defendant told the vice president, "You're too honest." Within hours of the conversation, the defendant reminded his supporters to meet in Washington before the certification proceedings, tweeting, "The big protest rally in Washington, D.C. will take place at 11 a.m. on January 6th. Locational details to follow. Stop the steal." On January 3rd, the defendant again told the vice president that at the certification proceeding, the vice president had the absolute right to reject electoral votes and the ability to overturn the election. The vice president responded that he had no such authority and that federal appeals courts had rejected the lawsuit making that claim that previous day. On January 3rd, co-conspirators 2 circulated a second memorandum that included a new plan under which, contrary to the ECA, the vice president would send the electoral slates to the state legislators to determine which slates to count. On January 4th, the defendant had a meeting with co-conspirator 2, the vice president chief of staff, and the vice president counsel for the purpose of convincing the vice president, based on the defendant's knowingly false claims of election fraud, that the vice president should reject or send to the state Biden's legitimate electoral votes rather than count them. The defendant deliberately excluded his White House counsel from the meeting because the White House counsel previously had pushed back on the defendant false claims of election fraud. During the meeting, as reflected in the Vice President contemptuous notes, the defendant made knowingly false claims of election fraud, including, bottom line, won every state by 100,000 of votes, and we won every state, and acts regarding a claim he senior Justice Department officials previously had told him was false, including as recently as the night before. What about 205,000 votes from more in Pennsylvania than voters? The defendant and co-conspirator to then asked the vice president to either unilaterally reject the legitimate electors from the 7 targeted states, or send the question of which slates was legitimate to the targeted states legislature. When the vice president challenged co-conspirator 2 on whether the proposal to return the question to the states was defensible, co-conspirator 2 responded, well, nobody's tested it before. The vice president then told defendant, did you hear that? Even your own counsel is not saying I have that authority. The defendant responded, that's okay. I prefer the other suggestion of the vice president rejecting the electors unilaterally. Also, on January 4th, when co-conspirator to acknowledge to the defendant's senior advisor that no court would support his proposal, the senior advisor told co-conspirator 2, you're going to cause riots in the streets. Co-conspirator 2 responded that there had previously been points in the notion history where violence was necessary to protect the republic. After the conversation, the senior advisor notified the defendant that co-conspirator 2 had conceded that his plan was not going to work. On the morning of January 5th, at the defendant's direction, the Vice President, Chief of Staff Counsel met again with co-conspirator 2. Co-conspirator 2 now advocated that the Vice President do what the defendant had said he preferred that the day before, unilaterally reject electors from the targeted states. During this meeting, co-conspirator 2 previously acknowledged to the Vice President counsel that he hoped to prevent judicial review of his proposal because he understood that it would be unanimously rejected by the Supreme Court. The Vice President counsel expressed to co-conspirator 2 that following through with the proposal would result in a disastrous situation where the election might have to be decided in the streets. The same day, the defendant encouraged supporters to travel to Washington on January 6th, and he set the false expectation that the vice president had the authority to and might use his ceremonial roles at the certification procedures to revise the election outcome in the defendant's favor, including issuing the following tweet. At 11:06 a.m., the vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors. At 11:06 a.m., the vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors. This was within 40 minutes of the defendant earlier reminder, seeing you in D.C. At 5:05 p.m., Washington is being inundated with people who don't want to see an election victory stolen. Our country has had enough. They won't take it anymore. We hear you and love you from the Oval Office. At 5:43 p.m., I will be speaking at the Save America rally tomorrow on the Ellipse at 11 a.m. Eastern, arriving early, doors open at 7 a.m. Eastern, big crowd. Also on January 5th, the defendant met along with the vice president when vice president refused to agree to defendant request that he obstruct the certification. The defendant grew frustrated and told the vice president that the defendant would have to publicly criticized him. Upon learning of this, the Vice President Chief of Staff was concerned for the Vice President's safety and alerted the head of the Vice President's Secret Service detail. As crowds to begun begun to gather in Washington, were audible from the Oval Office, the defendant remarked to advisors that the crowd the following day, on January 6th, was going to be angry. The night the defendant approved and caused the defendant campaign to issue a public statement that the defendant knew from his meeting with the vice president only hours earlier was false. The vice president and I are in total agreement that the vice president has the power to act. On January 6th, starting in the early mornings hours, the defendant again turned to knowingly false statements aimed at pressuring the vice president to fraudulently alter the election outcome and raise publicity and false expectations that the vice president might do so. At 1 a.m., the defendant issued a tweet that falsely claimed, "If Vice President Mike Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency. Many states want to decertify the mistakes they made in the certifying incorrect and even fraudulent numbers in a process not approved by their state legislators, which it might be. Mike, send it back." At 8:17 a.m., the defendant issued a tweet that falsely stated state went to correct their vote, which they now know they were based on irregularities and fraud plus corrupt process never received the legislative approval. All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the state and win, and we win. Do it, Mike. This is the time for extreme courage. On the morning January 6th, an agent of the defendant contacted the United States Senator to ask him to